Hello. The claim I'm responding to is that the upbringing of children using methods of corporal punishment have serious negative physical and emotional long-term effects on children and the community. And first, the advocate's first secondary claim is that corporal punishment has and can actually impose real serious injuries or even death. His second is corporal punishment is seen tied to many behavioral development problems. And his third, in some families, corporal punishment is passed down from generation to generation. Now, we're going to look at his first claim, is that corporal punishment can have serious injuries or even death. Now, there was a lack of evidence in his first claim. He only presented 2 actual pieces of evidence. And his first one was a story about a boy named James Wakararu. And he described the amount of trauma on his boy's body that ultimately causes death. However, this is not an example of corporal punishment. This is actually an example of child abuse. Child abuse is a prolonged beating of the child for out of anger or distress. Corporal punishment is a disciplinary action used by parents, such as spanking, to it's a disciplinary action. Now, because of this evidence does not support his claim at all, and so his claim is actually weakened by this. And next, his second piece of evidence is that corporal punishment can lead to death, and these cases are extremely rare. Now, ABC News polled Americans, and out of the Americans polled, 2/3 of them support corporal punishment. Now, how many times have you seen a case of a child getting spanked to death by the parent? It's extremely rare. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but it is extremely rare. Now, next we're going to look at the behavioral side to this. Now, the advocate did a little survey of the class, and I'm going to do the same thing. How many of you were spanked by your parent when you were growing up? I was one of them that raised their hand. I see a lot of you do it. And he himself he said he was spanked by his parent when he was young. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. How many of you go around beating up little kids because you were spanked by your parents? Okay, so mostly, pretty much none of you. It's because he overgeneralized these cases. He raised his hand, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, he raised his hand, so I got to put that out. But most of you don't do this. He overgeneralized these rare cases that have occurred. And the reason for this is we have to look at behavioral psychology in this. A punishment in psychology is defined by any action used to reduce a behavior. And most parents use this to self-define their authority or their rules. Now, we're going to do a little hypothetical. Say your mom told you don't play ball in the house, but it's raining outside, you really want to play ball, so you start throwing the ball around and you break the TV. Now, she's going to spank you because you broke the rules, so what are you not going to do now? You're not going to play ball in the house because you don't want to get spanked. This is how the punishment works. You don't want the spanking, so you don't want to do this. You don't want to break the rules. Now, you take this from your childhood, and you're going to take it with you all the way up to your adult life. So you're not going to break the rules. You're not going to be a menace to society. You're actually going to conform to society, much like you are now. You're all in college, even though you were spanked. You're all getting a higher education and conforming to society. You're not going around shoplifting, fighting people, or any other things that he generalized on these rare cases. Now, a study by a psychologist named Dr. Broman found that after a long-term study of 100 families, if you eliminate all those extreme cases of abuse or the parents punishing kids with paddles or harming their face, she found that there were no detrimental effects when confounding influences were spread out, and the few that remain could be explained by other aspects of the parent-child relationship. So there's actually little evidence to show that spanking causes any sort of behavioral problems in your childhood. Now, his third claim, in some families, corporal punishment is passed down from generation to generation. This acts as a chain claim, and relies on the strength of the first 2 claims. But however, the first claim that corporal punishment could impose some serious injuries or even death, I have shown that it's actually not the case. The cases when the serious injuries or death cases are extremely rare that you can't generalize this, and the other example he showed was not actually a case of corporal punishment. And his second claim that there are behavioral problems. I've also shown that there are actually no behavioral problems from, well, I can't say no, but there are very rare cases of behavioral problems. So this last claim can't even stand because of the fact that it's a chain claim. And that's it.
All right, well, let's kind of start in the middle with all the surveying stuff, because I think that's an interesting way to do this. It makes the audience more interactive and kind of reminds them that they need to participate in analyzing this. On the other hand, of course, it may take some things out of your control because you don't necessarily know what the results are going to be. And there's always some smartass who holds their hand up to take a position. I assume that maybe that was, in fact, the advocate themselves talking about that. Yeah, I beat up little kids. I think, though, that you have a nice statistic in the middle that suggests another way to minimize this. Look, 2/3 of Americans seem to approve of corporal punishment and probably engage in it, yet the frequency with which we're having kids injured, the number of bullies that are coming about, these kinds of things appear to be grossly inflated, Gesundheit, in context to the 200 million Americans who approve of this kind of thing. So that's, I think, a way to put that into perspective. You know, the surveying thing is an okay thing, but let's include it with the other data that you have on that point. I thought the argument on the first point was pretty straightforward. Basically, it's an equivocation argument that they are treating corporal punishment and child abuse as the same thing, when in fact they are substantially different, and that corporal punishment does not, in fact, inflict the kinds of injuries that are exemplified in the example that the advocate cited. And I thought that was a very good challenge on that point. You also had a good piece of evidence right on the bottom of the second point that talked about how once we controlled for those extreme cases and we took them out, the truth is that there appears to be a negligible effect of corporal punishment on the people in this particular study. And I thought that that was an effective way of making the argument, once again, that the advocate is taking extreme cases, treating them as that they are the representation of what corporal punishment is, and that's why you can't reach a valid conclusion. On your challenge on the third point, I understand the idea of suggesting that it's really connected to, that it's a chain argument, and that if the first 2 points aren't valid, then it doesn't really matter what's going on this third point. I think there's a good point to be made here that child abuse may in fact be a something that gets passed on, but the idea of corporal punishment producing these kinds of effects needs to be demonstrated by the advocate, and that it wasn't really, and especially given the two arguments you made above, that seems to be a little bit problematic. I think you could use a little bit more summary at the end. It just felt sort of like you bailed right at the end of the argument. All right, thank you.